Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Rotman. I'm a professor at Smith College here in Northampton, Massachusetts, and I'm a scholar of Indian Buddhism, particularly focusing on Indian Buddhist narratives. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today to join you at this expo and to talk about meditation, a journey to find the true self, a journey for self-discovery. Now, let me explain a little bit about what I'm going to do in this next 50 minutes or so. Um, Today, I want to talk about a particular kind of meditation involving hungry ghosts. Now, this is a unique topic for investigation, as often conversations about meditation involve talk about various standard types of meditation, vipassana or focusing on the jhanas. But today I want to focus on a form of meditation that leads to a particular kind of ethical transformation, which has the possibility to change each and every one of you and also the world around us. So today, as I said, I want to focus on hungry ghosts. What is a hungry ghost? Now, the easiest way to understand hungry ghosts are to think about the way that Buddhism describes the world as being made up of various realms of existence. We have up high, we have the realms of heaven and other heavenly beings, the asuras, sometimes known as the anti-gods. And at this level, we have the realm of humans, that's where we are. And then we also have the realm of animals, that is kind of part of our world. And below us, the realm of hell beings and hungry ghosts. Now, what's interesting about this analysis of the world is that within these realms, there are actually divisions. So we read about many kinds of divine beings having different forms and different bodies and different mental states, and the various activities that we can do here to be reborn as one of these types of gods. And likewise, within the hell realms, we read about 10 cold realms and 10 hot realms, and the various kinds of terrible deeds that we can do as humans to be reborn in one of those realms. And likewise, with animals, we know that there is a pecking order in the animal realm. Some live longer, have greater mental faculties, and some live shorter lives that are filled with suffering. And in the standard analysis of all of these realms, the idea is that you reap what you sow, and that there are a variety of actions that can lead to a variety of results in these various realms. But the hungry ghost realm is different. In much of the material we read about hungry ghosts, there is one singular cause that leads one to be reborn as a hungry ghost. And in much of the earliest material, and later still, there's basically one class of hungry ghosts, although we'll hear more about differences that arise later on. And what leads one to be reborn as a hungry ghost is the cultivation of a very particular mental state. And that mental state in Sanskrit is known as matsarya. And we might think of matsarya here as a kind of double meanness. It's a meanness that starts as a stinginess, a miserliness, a clinging to one's possessions, and that this then leads to a kind of acting out, a kind of meanness that one puts on others, acting out in spite and cruelty. So what's interesting in this early kind of Buddhist world is that they focused on one particular mindset that leads to one set of actions, and they've pulled it out because they recognize it as a unique danger, as something that can infect all of us. So the reason to focus on this is because it's so easy to be susceptible to the problem of this double meanness. The most difficult part, perhaps, about this double meanness, as we'll discuss soon, is that it comes with a kind of self-righteousness, such that even though you've moved very far away from the Dharma, from the good, from the righteous, and embraced a deviant form of logic, your own self-righteousness leads you to believe that what you have done is true and that what you have understand is the true way. So one way to begin to understand the hungry ghosts and this pathology of hungry ghosts is to look at some of the earliest textual materials that we have. So what I want to do in the minutes that come is we're going to look closely at some particular stories from one of the earliest compilations that we have about hungry ghosts. Then after we look at these kind of textual ideas, I want to look more closely at how this idea of meanness has been understood by various commentators. And after that, we'll look at some visual materials, some artworks, because hungry ghosts have been represented by many, and that's been an important way for people to understand and grapple with hungry ghosts. And then in the end, we'll kind of wrap up and think, how can we use hungry ghosts and the logic of meanness to lead better lives? How can it be an object of meditation for us and a possibility for transformation? So let's focus first on this early compilation of Buddhist narratives. So some of the earliest stories that we have about hungry ghosts are found in the Avadana Shataka. These were tales that were for both monastics and for laity, and many of them eventually kind of were merged into the Mula Sarvastivadaya monastic code, such that they're preserved for, as I said, monastics, and also meant to be disseminated to lay people. Now, what's interesting about this kind of code of 100 stories, it's that it divided up into books of 10. So we have 10 predictions about becoming a Buddha, 10 stories about the Buddha's previous lives, 10 stories about those who become solitary Buddhas, and so on, and 10 stories about hungry ghosts. Now, what's interesting, so much that's interesting. One thing that I find very interesting about these kind of stories of hungry ghosts is that they're surprisingly uniform. They present a cohesive vision of the problem of Matsarya, the problem of meanness, and they offer a path out. So these aren't sort of random stories. These are stories that came to function as law and stories that we might think of as deep philosophy, but in the guise of a story that's accessible for all. So what I want to do first is just to look at one story. It's relatively short, to give us some sense of how hungry ghosts are introduced and what problems they represent for all of us. So the story I want to look at is called Varchagataha, a pot of shit. And it starts by telling us that the Buddha at one time was staying near the city of Rajagriha, modern-day Rajgir, not far from Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha gave his first teachings, along with the community of monks in a place called Kalandaka Nivapa, squirrel feeding place. Okay, so one morning, the Venerable Moggalliyana, the Buddha's one of his main disciples, it says, got dressed, took his bowl and robe, and entered Rajagriha for alms. Having approached, he made his way up Vulture's Peak and then sat down at the base of a tree for a midday rest. We can imagine Moggalliyana in a sort of lonely place, but a place that we might say is holy, loaded with meaning for the Buddhist community. Then it says, then the Venerable Moggalliyana saw a hungry ghost who looked like a burned out tree stump, naked and totally covered with hair, with a mouth like the eye of a needle and a stomach like a mountain. She was ablaze, alight, aflame, a single fiery mass, a perpetual cremation. Tormented by thirst, she was racked with sensations that were searing, piercing, distressing, agonizing, and acute, and she was crying out in pain. She was foul-smelling, really foul-smelling. She looked like shit, and she was feeding on feces, and even those she only procured with difficulty. So this is one of the very first representations we have of hungry ghosts in Buddhist material. So what that means is that when they're trying to eat, their mouths are barely open. They're like pinpricks, and yet their stomachs are like mountains. So we know that these beings are cursed with never being able to be satisfied. And they're also tormented by thirst, right? So they're tormented by hunger, they're tormented by thirst, and they're filled with sensations that are searing, piercing, distressing, agonizing, acute. So this is some being hungry, thirsty, barely sensate, but yet distressed in pain. A very difficult situation for beings like this. And she was foul smelling. Literally, she looks like excrement and was feeding on excrement. Now, what the texts tell us, not right here, but we find later on, is that hungry ghosts are cursed in such a way that even if they do find food, all the food that they procure turns into urine or excrement. So they're fabulously hungry, and yet they can never be satisfied. So upon seeing her, it says, the text, the Venerable Mogdhyayana was deeply moved. He experienced samvega. We'll talk about this again, because this in many ways is key to understanding hungry ghosts. They produce samvega in us. They move us, and by being moved, we can be transformed. So upon seeing her, the Venerable Mogdhyayana was deeply moved, and he questioned the hungry ghost, what sin did you commit such that you experience a result like this? And the hungry ghost said, I'm a sinner, Bhadanta Mogdhyayana. Ask the Blessed One about the matter. He'll explain to you the deed that led me to this fate. And when other beings hear his account, they will refrain from this sinful deed. So at this time, then Mogdhyayana approaches the Buddha, who was emerging from meditation and was giving a talk to the assembly of monks and nuns. And so then the Buddha tells Mogdhyayana, come near, Mogdhyayana, welcome. Where are you coming from? So Mogdhyayana says to the Buddha, he says, Bhadanta, I'm coming from a journey through the realm of hungry ghosts. He adds, just by her sight, rivers and wells would dry up. And when the heavens sent rain, on her would fall a shower of sparks and embers. She was foul-smelling, really foul-smelling. She looked like excrement, and she was feeding on excrement. And even that she only procured with difficulty. So such is her bad karma that she's almost like a force field for bad karma. When rain lands and offers relief on others, for her it is simply like a spark of embers. And everything she looks like excrement and everything she touches turns into excrement, and when she feeds herself, even that she can only reach with difficulty. And then just to emphasize again this experience, Mogdhyayana recites this verse. He says, naked and covered with hair, emaciated like an upright skeleton, racked with searing sensations and crying out in pain, she runs around suffering, piles of excrement everywhere. Wailing, I drink and eat only excrement, and even that she only gets with difficulty. So then Mogdhyayana says, the Buddha says to Mogdhyayana, that hungry ghost is a sinner. Do you want to hear the deed that led her to this fate? Yes, Bhadanta, said Mogdhyayana. Then listen to this. Concentrate well and closely, I will speak. Long ago, Bhadanta, in the city of Varanasi, there was a solitary Buddha who had compassion for the poor and neglected and who stayed in remote areas. So solitary Buddhas, unlike Buddhas like Gautama Buddha, our Buddha, are different in part because they're solitary, but also because they don't teach the Dharma, or I should say, they don't teach the Dharma in words. What's said about solitary Buddha is that they teach the Dharma through their actions. So if you want to learn from a solitary Buddha, watch what they do, don't simply read what they've said. So afflicted with an illness, this solitary Buddha entered Varanasi for alms after a doctor had prescribed for him a diet of wholesome food. He approached the home of a merchant. The merchant saw him and asked, Noble one, do you need anything? He said, homemade, nutritious food. Then the merchant instructed his daughter-in-law, give wholesome food to the noble one. In his daughter-in-law, there arose a meanness. So this is the first time that we've come across this word, matsarya. as I said, what I'm translating as meanness. And this will be key to understanding what it is to be a hungry ghost, how one becomes a hungry ghost, and how one avoids it. So this young woman has just been instructed by her father-in-law to give hungry food to the noble one. So in her then arises this meanness, and she thinks, if I give him food today, he'll just come back again tomorrow. She retreated indoors, filled a bowl with excrement, then covered it with food, and proceeded to give it to the solitary Buddha. Now, the knowledge and insights of disciples and solitary Buddhas does not operate unless they focus their attention. So the solitary Buddha accepted the food, and only after accepting it did he realize how much it smelled. She must have filled it with excrement, he thought. Then that great being dumped out his bowl to one side and departed. So the young woman is instructed to give wholesome food to this solitary Buddha. And she thinks, oh, if I give it to him, he'll just come back again, meaning I'll have to give more and more. And then instead of simply saying, I don't want to do that, or simply deciding to disobey the orders of her father-in-law, she acts out with meanness. She acts out with cruelty. She goes indoors. She fills the solitary Buddha's bowl with excrement, then covers it with food to deceive him, and then offers him this bowl with excrement on the bottom and food on the top. Now, it says that a solitary Buddha's insight is not operative unless he focuses his attention. And why this matters is that the solitary Buddha had not focused attention, so he actually accepted the bowl of food and excrement from the young woman, meaning that she had completed an action. She had a full karmic deed of offering something terrible to this great field of merit, who is a solitary Buddha. And when the solitary Buddha realizes this, of course, he dumps out the bowl and departs. So then the Blessed One says this to Moggalliyana. And remember, this is one of the Buddha's greatest disciples. So not a novice, not a layperson like all of us, but someone who is an advanced practitioner. And he says, what do you think, Moggalliyana? The merchant's daughter-in-law at that time and at that juncture is now this hungry ghost. Since she performed such a sinful deed, as a result, ever since, she is always reborn as a hell being, animal, or hungry ghost, and she always feeds on excrement. Therefore, Moggalliyana, work hard to rid yourself of meanness. That way you won't develop the same faults as that hungry ghost. It is this, Moggalliyana, that you should learn to do. So what's interesting is that she performs this sinful deed, and as a result is always reborn as a hell being, animal, or hungry ghost, and she's always feeding on excrement. And then the Buddha says to Moggalliyana, work hard to rid yourself of meanness. So what's interesting is that even an advanced practitioner, as advanced as anyone we here would ever be likely to meet, is still susceptible to meanness, meaning that meanness will arise. And our goal is to not latch onto it, to not let meanness rule us, but simply to watch it as it arises and let it fall away. And this is what we should learn to do, and this is what we should practice. And then it says at the end, this was said by the Blessed One, and with their minds uplifted, the Venerable Moggalliyana and various gods and anti-gods, heavenly beings, kinnaras, great snakes, and so on, rejoiced at the words of the Blessed One. And so ends that story. So we have this story about hungry ghosts and what causes one to be born as a hungry ghost. And what we know is that it's Matsarya, and that what do we know about Matsarya so far? We know that it's really dangerous because it can lead one to be reborn as a hungry ghost, and that's a terrible state of being. And that we know that even advanced practitioners like Moggalliyana have to be wary of it. And we'll know from stories that it can happen. It can arise in men, it can arise in women, it can arise in monks, it can arise in nuns, it can arise in the young, and it can arise in the old. All of us are susceptible to it. And I think that's why it was focused on in early Buddhist discourse. They recognized it as something that we were all susceptible to. And we're going to say that it has a double danger. It has a singular danger for us in that it can delude us. And then by acting from this meanness, we can have a terrible rebirth. But more important for the present is that by acting in this way, it sows dissent. Because when we're infected with meanness, we act cruelly to others. And by acting cruelly to others, we sever a social world. And one main concern that we have in the early Buddhist monastic world is to build a community. And what Matsarya does, what meanness does, is it breaks communities. Now, let me think a little bit. So what is Matsarya? Now we can get a little bit more. So often Matsarya, when we find it in context, it's paired with other words that all mean something like miserliness, close-fistedness, lacking generosity, clutching something, holding close. But these are descriptions of hoarders, those who don't share or practice generosity. But hoarding is not enough to explain why someone would act cruelly and put excrement in a monk's bowl. So one way to begin to make sense of Matsarya is to look at what the commentators have said. And the lineage of commentators that I find most helpful here is a lineage not with Sanskrit, but with Pali. And starting with the great commentator Buddhaghosa, the most famous of all Pali commentators, whose insights are unerringly helpful. So Buddhaghosa, in his great text, the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification, explains Macharya, the Pali word for Matsarya, like this. And notice here that we might say that in his understanding of Macharya, maybe miserliness might work better than meanness, but we'll let you decide. So he says this: it is meanness or miserliness. Its characteristic is concealing one's own prosperity, whether already attained or yet to be attained. Its function is not enduring the condition of sharing that prosperity with others. Its manifestation is contraction, or its manifestation is closed-fistedness. Its proximate cause is one's own prosperity. It should not be seen as a condition of mental deformity. So what's interesting, I think, about this very technical definition is that its characteristic is concealing one's own property. So you have the sense that you have one's own property and you're kind of holding onto it. He talks about it as a manifestation of contraction. So you're holding onto it. And what its cause is one's own prosperity, that you have prosperity and you don't want to lose it. So this isn't quite the meanness that we have in our texts, but we're getting a certain sense of where it comes from, or we might say what its close relations are, and that is a kind of holding on to something tight. Now, one way to better make sense of this version of meanness that we find in the text is to notice that in one of these 10 stories about meanness, in these 10 stories in the Avadana Shataka, which I've been talking about, this 100 stories, one of them is actually not about meanness, but it's about jealousy, irsha. And we find for the early commentators, you can't really understand Matsarya without irsha. You can't really understand meanness without jealousy or envy, that the two are intertwined. So here, if we look at Buddhaghosa again, we might be able to complement the notion of what meanness looked like for him. And he says this about Issa, envy. He says, it is envying. It has the characteristic of being jealous of another's prosperity. Its function is to be dissatisfied with that prosperity. Its manifestation is an aversion from that prosperity. Its proximate cause is another's prosperity. It should be regarded as a bond to existence. So if we think about these two maybe paired together, which they often are in philosophical materials, we have one part where we have our property and prosperity, and we don't want to lose it, and we hold tight to it. But also we have other people's property and prosperity, which makes us suddenly doubt our own property and prosperity. And a comparison comes into place, and what it does is it further binds us to existence. We are angry with ourselves, we're angry with others, or we're dissatisfied with both. And this binds us further into kind of the human cause. And what the text imagines here, we find in Buddhaghosa, is viewing the world as a kind of battleground for prosperity, whereby one's gain is another's loss, and another's gain is one's own loss. This is what Buddhaghosa is getting at. We can imagine a world where simply to give something to someone else is a loss for you. It's not about thinking as a collective, it's pitting me against others. Now, this is not what we find. Well, actually, let me continue on. So the text actually talks about one way to make sense of this idea of property and prosperity is to think about the 5 kinds of meanness that we find described in texts and to see how this would work out. So they talk that you can have meanness with regard to 5 things. And one of them is residence, home. So one can imagine having your home and clinging to your home, but then also noticing that someone else's home maybe is bigger and nicer. And it leads a dissatisfaction with your own situation and maybe a kind of envy or anger at the situation of others. And we can also have it with families. We can imagine another family being happier, healthier, better off, more successful, looking at yourself and looking at others. Likewise with material gain. Does someone else make more money than me? I look at myself and I look at others. I engage in this kind of comparison, and suddenly I look at the world as a kind of battleground. So we have home, families, material gain, reputation, and even Buddhist doctrine. We can imagine those who think, I know more of the teachings than others. I don't want to share with others. Or someone else knows more of the teachings with me, and then I envy them, and maybe I'm angry at them. So we see this world of meanness here, mixed with a bit of envy, as creating a world that looks like a battleground, a concern with self and others that leads someone to jealousy. Reminiscent here is actually small children with their toys. They don't want to share their toys with others. They're angry when someone else has a toy and won't share it with them, or simply they want to take it. Imagine the worst of small children fighting. So it's not simply, I'm looking forward here. Other scholars as well, if we don't just focus on Buddhaghosa and kind of ancient commentators, but look at modern teachers as well, we gain a little bit more insight that might be helpful for us in kind of understanding the meanness, not simply in the early stories that we read, but also so that it can become a full-fledged object of meditation for us. What are we thinking about when we look at meanness in ourselves? So here we find an explanation by Mahasi Sayadaw. He's a renowned 20th century Burmese monk, a prolific author, and an important meditation teacher, particularly within the Vipassana tradition. And this is what he says about Macharya, meanness. He says, stinginess, this is his translating here it as stinginess with regards to gain, is to be jealous of another's personal gain. It is also stinginess regarding gain to be unwilling to share one's belongings with worthy people, such as respectable fellow monks and so on. It may not be stinginess, however, if one is too fond of something to give it away. It could also be attachment. Note that the characteristic of stinginess is to be unable to bear that others possess or use one's belongings, whereas the characteristic of greed is to be attached to one's belongings without being able to give them away. Now, he makes an interesting and I think important distinction for us. So one version is greed, and that's just you're holding on to things, right? You just don't want to give anything maybe to anyone. It's all yours. But that's not quite what he's saying. He's saying that the characteristic of stinginess is to be unable to bear that others possess or use one's belongings. It's this looking at others and seeing what they have and finding it unbearable. Now, unbearableness, this is a term that's going to come up again and again in the commentaries. Is it something that for you that becomes intolerable? Simply thinking about it, witnessing it, contemplating it, meditating on it, creates a feeling of unbearableness for you. Again, this is the vision of a world as a battleground, and someone else's success is your loss. And the reason, as I said again, that the Buddhists recognize this as so dangerous is that it's dangerous for the individuals and that leads to terrible karmic consequences, but it's also dangerous for the society at large because to view this world, the world this way, means that one does not develop communities. One lives in an isolated world, pitted against others, and can't join in common cause and can't create a world of friends. So another commentator, this is Ashin Janakabhivamsa, another renowned 20th century Burmese monk and prolific author, offers another commentary here that I think is helpful at getting at this sense of unbearableness. And he says this, stinginess, macharya, is the nature of macharya. Nowadays, those who are not charitable and those who are reluctant to give anything to anybody are called people with macharya. But actually, macharya is not the lack of a will to give or to be charitable. It is wishing that others do not get anything. Not wanting to give is only the clinging to one's possessions. It is lobha, attachment. Macharya is the wish that others do not get anything by way of material gains or attributes, regardless of whether or not the materials or attributes belong to one. So again, this is an interesting idea that key to this phenomenon, right, this kind of mental state, isn't simply what I have and the afraid that I'm going to lose it or the afraid that someone else will take it. It's also seeing someone else and wishing that they get nothing, right? It's a perverse notion of justice that you want others to get nothing. So what we could say the insidiousness of this mental state is that it leads us to view others as a danger, right? And to view others as a kind of enemy. And sharing with them is somehow supporting the enemy. So now we have a kind of vision of, we could say a little bit deeper vision of Matsarya, of this double beingness. It is, so now let's see if I can sum up a little bit about what this meanness is, having looked at the stories and now having looked at these commentators. So Matsarya is a double meanness. It starts with a kind of clinging, a kind of stinginess and miserliness. And this is something recognized by all the Pali commentators. But what we find in the narrative is that it also involves others. And we're finding this in the commentary as well, because you're clinging on to something. And then because of this clinging, you lash out at others. You act with cruelty and vindictiveness at the thought of them getting something from you or them getting something that they don't deserve. Because the world is a kind of battleground and someone else's gain is your loss. Now, what the text tells us is that this is not dharma. This is not righteousness. This is self-righteousness. This is delusion. And this is the most dangerous part about Matsarya, is that when you're infected with Matsarya, you believe that your deluded, self-righteous version of the world is actually what is just. So in the case of the young woman who wouldn't offer nutritious food to the solitary Buddha, her father-in-law had told her, please do this, and yet she refused. She thought her own version of justice was more just than her father-in-law's, or more just than anything else, that somehow cruelty was the right response. So cruelty is the right response. That's what we're trying to eradicate here. And that's the danger, where suddenly cruelty becomes naturalized and cruelty seems like the right thing to do. Okay. Now, what I want to do now is to pause on this kind of conversation of hungry ghosts and to look at some images, because images have been a key way that people have taught kind of what it is to be a hungry ghost and how to avoid it. And that this might help us kind of nuance our conversation about kind of what a hungry ghost is and how we might avoid such a fate. So I'm going to share my screen and look at some hungry ghosts through images as a way, as I said, to better understand hungry ghosts and how we can avoid becoming them. So this is one of the first images that we have of hungry ghosts. And one of the things that we'll find about hungry ghosts is that they're represented in different ways at different times. There is not one static representation of hungry ghosts, and I can find no images that closely adhere to the earliest representations of hungry ghosts that we found in the text that I just read to you. So instead, the earliest reference that we have pretty much is this painting from the Kizil Cave complex, maybe 5th century CE, and a version of this image in story form occurs in one of the texts I translated, Divine Stories Part 1. And in this case, we have a group of hungry ghosts who are trapped in an iron city. And what's interesting here is notice that their bodies do not look like the hungry ghosts we had described. We can see that they're thin, maybe slightly emaciated, but they don't have tiny mouths, they don't have stomach-like mountains, and they're not inflamed. And if we thought about their bodies as kind of prison houses, here they're actually in the prison house of something like an iron city. This second image is a favorite of mine. It's a detail from a wall painting on the Bezeklik Cave in Turfan. It's part of a giant kind of painting, and this is just one little detail. And here we have these hungry ghosts in almost like cartoonish form. And again, we don't have tiny necks, we don't have giant stomachs, but we do have flames. It's the first time that we see flames. And although their whole bodies are not inflamed, it seems more that, are they breathing flames? We're not really sure. Later, we find descriptions that hungry ghosts in some ways are so hungry, in some ways that they breathe fire. And that everything that they touch fire. Here's another wonderful painting. This is from the 13th century and from China. And it's from the path of the Hungry Ghosts, one of a number of paintings. And here, what we find is that hungry ghosts are imagined not as a singular, as I am a hungry ghost, but here as, we could say 10 different classes. And we can find that the first class are these 3 hungry ghosts on the top. We have a flaming mouth hungry ghost, that's who we see on the top, a needle throat ghost, and a stinking or stench mouth hungry ghost. The idea is that they look a little bit like the hungry ghosts that we saw before. We can see tiny necks, and we can see extended stomachs, slightly emaciated. So this is a vision, we could say, akin to what we've been hearing about in the stories. And then we have a second, we might say, perhaps slightly higher class, or we could say it's higher status hungry ghosts. On the far left are needle fur ghosts, whose kind of fur is like sharp needles that stab them. Then the second is the stench fur ghost, whose hairs are sharp and that smells even bad smell for himself. And a third, a goiter hungry ghost. And you can imagine having a goiter, again, how it would make it difficult to eat or drink, and that would just make life difficult. And here we might say this is like the royalty among ghosts. We could say, we can see how they're dressed with ornaments and jewels. And in the front, not really a hungry ghost at all, someone who is probably imagined as an Indian seer. So the difference here is that we see a kind of hierarchy of ghosts, much like we have a hierarchy of heavenly beings and a hierarchy of hell beings. So the idea is that there could be different kinds of deeds that lead to different kinds of rebirth within the hungry ghost realm. This is not what we find in the earlier texts, but here we might say it's both a discouragement, the danger of something, right, of kind of the worst of these conditions, but also a way, an encouragement that perhaps we could move and be something better. And yet again, other versions of hungry ghosts, we find them taking different forms in different places because they're meant to inspire us to charity. And here in a very famous Thai narrative about Prabalai, this is the opening pages of a manuscript about the great adventures of Prabalai, visiting the realm of hungry ghosts on the left and hell beings on the right. And if we look at this realm of hungry ghosts here, we find hungry ghosts in various kinds of torments. Yes, we find flames once again, but we find here a monk on the, we could say someone on the far left with what is then an enlarged testicles thrown over his shoulder. And this, the text tells us, is a curse for government officials who do not share with the people they are meant to serve. And others here, humans with no face, and instead a face where their genitals should be. Another with a kind of bull-like face, and another with a forehead burning. So again, different visions of what it might look like to be a hungry ghost in different places. In modern India, this starts in the 19th century. This logic of hungry ghosts and unique torments enters into the kind of Indian world, especially through the Jain tradition, with this idea that we have unique torments for the actions we perform. And that again, to put a rope through a bull's nose will lead us to the same fate for ourselves. To be cutting fish will be leading to this fate. We get a kind of before and after, this logic that we reap exactly what we sow, and we can very well expect unique torments of hungry ghosts. And then lastly, a very modern image, 2015, which oddly is the closest to the text that we read, the Avadana Shataka, this early text. In here we see a group of hungry ghosts, naked, not covered with hair, but tiny necks, gigantic stomachs, bulging eyes, thinning hair, feeding on urine and excrement. So let me set that aside. So what do we do with these images? The last few minutes, I want to talk about why these images matter. Now, if you remember, in the story of Pot of Shit, Moggilliana, when he saw that hungry ghost, he felt samvega. And samvega, as I said, is to be deeply moved. And what the texts say is that one of the ways to be aware of our meanness and to eradicate our meanness is to be shaken from our complacency. And we do that actually by contemplating something that moves us, that shakes us. And in the case of these texts, something that is disgusting. And these hungry ghosts are disgusting in some ways. But yet what the text wants to focus on is not the disgustingness that is hungry ghost bodies, but the disgustingness of the mindset that leads us to become hungry ghosts. The mindset of meanness is disgusting. Far more disgusting than simply the physical body of another being. But perhaps we can look at these beings, look at those who are starving and struggling in our midst, and use that as a kind of a meditation aid to focus on the disgustingness that might have led to such a condition. By the karmic logic, it is a disgusting mental thought that leads to a kind of disgusting outcome. And what we should focus on is that disgustingness and see if we can eradicate it. So what's our task? Our task within the world of hungry ghosts is to recognize that there is a form of meanness that is common in humans, even in those who are advanced beings, and that it leads to terrible results. And the antidote to meanness is one, recognition that meanness might arise and we don't want to latch onto it. And the other way to combat this stinginess, this miserliness, this cruelty, is to be charitable and to be kind, to do the exact opposite. Don't hold on to things, but give them away. Give charity to those who need. Don't act with cruelty. Don't act with spite. Act with love and act with compassion. There's another story in this collection which has a monk who's dying of thirst, who finally comes to a well, asks the young woman for a glass of water, and she looks at him and says, "I wouldn't give you a glass of water. I wouldn't give you a glass of water if you were the last being on earth. My water pot wouldn't be full." So again, she could easily offer him a glass of water, but she doesn't because of cruelty. She's holding on to the water and she's acting with spite. And our goal is to be the exact opposite of that. To act with charitableness and to act with love and to act with care. And if we can all meditate on that, I think we can transform ourselves and transform the world around us. Thank you all so much.
네, 앤디 로트만 교수님의 강연을 영상으로 만나보셨는데요. 앤디 로트만 교수님께서 정말 감사하게도 명상 실습 영상을 추가로 보내주셨습니다. 영상과 함께 실습을 진행해 보겠습니다.
I would like to offer a short meditation for all of you. Let's call it guarding against meanness. Now, meanness can arise in any of us. The goal, however, is for it not to take hold, not to turn into a form of self-righteousness that manifests as cruelty and then justifies it. We don't want our minds polluted with the idea that the person before us is somehow disgusting. When that happens, our minds become disgusting, and that's bad for us and bad for all those around us. Instead, we want to watch as meanness arises so that it can fall away. We want to turn meanness into compassion, love, and positive action. Now, close your eyes. That's right, eyes closed. Now, envision a person that when you see them, your first response is disgust. Picture a person for whom you feel revulsion. Perhaps your trigger is what they look like. Perhaps they smell bad. It might be someone who's physically deformed, with festering wounds. If you can, call to mind an actual person. Best would be to imagine someone who is generally not seen, like the hungry ghosts in our story. Perhaps someone on the margins of society, like one who is unhoused or just barely getting by. The key now is to not allow meanness to arise in your heart. Now envision yourself approaching them and using what could be a trigger for revulsion, for disgust, for meanness, turn that trigger into compassion. See them and let compassion fill you. Now, open your heart to the suffering of others, even when we aren't sure how to help them. We could vow to embrace even the lowliest. The key here is to see someone for whom disgust seems almost natural, almost inevitable. And then when those feelings of disgust and meanness arise, to let them fall away and to let compassion arise instead. Compassion can be transformative. As you envision this figure of disgust in your mind and you feel compassion now arise, let it fill you. And now, when you imagine that being who could be an object of disgust, it can now be an object of love, a prompt for compassion, a prompt for doing good in the world, a prompt for lessening the suffering in the world. Now, imagine the meanness. Imagine it being on the outskirts of your awareness. And as you see it, let it go. And as you feel it arise in you, let it go. As the Buddha says in the stories, the goal is to eradicate this meanness. For meanness can arise in all of us. And as it arises, we let it go. Now you can open your eyes. The goal here, as I said before, is not to allow meanness to arise in us, and yet knowing that all of us are susceptible to meanness. All of us are susceptible to the self-righteousness that allows meanness to be justified, that allows cruelty to be justified, and that pollutes our minds. So we keep this mindfulness in our heads and in our hearts, and when we see someone or something, and we begin to feel that meanness, and we begin to justify acts of cruelty, call on that love and compassion to guard against meanness and to keep us acting in good faith. Thank you.